Well, the debt ceiling bill headed to the House floor tonight for a vote after clearing a key procedural hurdle last night. At least 30 Republicans and one Democrat have said they are no on this deal, despite House Speaker Kevin McCarthy saying he has the votes to pass it. The Congressional Budget Office says that the deal could trim the deficit by $1.5 trillion over the next decade. Joining me right now is Louisiana Congressman and House Majority Leader Steve Scalise. Congressman, it's great to see you this morning. Thanks so much for being here.
Always great to be with you, Maria. Good morning.
Do you believe the Republicans have the votes to pass this in the House tonight?
Yes, it'll pass tonight. We're going to start a debate. Then we're going to go into the rule itself around 3:30 and then have debate and later tonight pass the bill.
Look, I think Kevin McCarthy, you have to give him an enormous amount of credit for actually getting this president to admit spending needs to be coming in, to get an actual cut in spending next year versus this year. But what is your take on the criticism coming out of the Freedom Caucus? We've got Congressman Chip Roy, Dan Bishop indicating yesterday that they'd consider ousting House Speaker McCarthy over this debt ceiling legislation. Bishop claimed he had zero confidence in McCarthy's leadership, despite what McCarthy has done. Here's what the speaker said about this yesterday. Watch.
Have you had any conversations with members of the Freedom Caucus that have been against this bill and now are saying they might vote motion to vacate?
I'm not sure what in the bill people are concerned about. It is the largest savings of $2.1 trillion we've ever had. It's the first time in history the largest rescissions, where we're pulling money back from the hardworking taxpayers that are going to China. Now, if people are against saving all that money or work reforms in welfare reform, I can't do anything about it.
What's your reaction, Congressman?
Yeah, and I share Kevin's assessment. Look, Speaker McCarthy did a really good job at getting President Biden to the table. And if you go back to January and then that first meeting in February, President Biden was insistent. He was not going to negotiate. Work requirements were a red line that the White House would not give on. We got that. We've got a number of cuts. We got real reforms to permitting, which is going to allow for more jobs to be created. We reclaim all the unspent COVID money. You're talking about almost $30 billion right there. At the end of the day, you always want to get more. There is more that we want to fight for. And I think, whether it's people like me that support this bill or Freedom Caucus members that are opposing it, it's because they want to see more cuts. But at least we start the process of cutting spending in Washington. That's something we haven't seen in this town for over 10 years, Maria, and it has to start now. And then let's go fight and get more. We got the appropriations process coming up to do just that, starting in a few weeks.
Well, one of the promises that Kevin McCarthy made was that he wanted to rescind that $80 billion going to the IRS so that Joe Biden could hire 87,000 new IRS agents to audit American families. He got some money pulled back for 1 year, but not much beyond that. And Scott Perry was on with us earlier from Freedom Caucus, and he said, even if you look at the caps in spending, it's not actual caps, that it's actually just targets. He said, I read the bill, it's just targets. There's nothing to hold anybody to these caps. What are your thoughts?
Well, the first year, there's an actual reduction in spending over where we are currently. That, again, that hasn't been something that has been signed into law going back pre-sequester. If you look at the IRS, the first year of the ability for the Biden administration to hire more IRS agents, there's over $1 billion in cuts to the IRS. And we've been very clear. We're going to keep going back at that, not just next year, but later in this appropriations process. And Scott was one of those people that was at the meeting. We had a long meeting last night, about 3 hours long with the full membership, going through all of this, not just what's in the bill, but the things we want to then do after this bill is passed to keep fighting to get spending under control in Washington and get our economy back on track. But it starts with this bill. Remember, the alternative is a clean debt ceiling as opposed to real cuts, real reforms that are in this bill.
So what do you envision in terms of the appropriations process, Congressman? Where are you looking for areas that the Republicans can actually hold back funding?
Yeah, Kay Granger and her committee have already started the appropriations process. The subcommittees have been hearing. There's 12 different bills. We want to start moving those bills. The biggest one is the Department of Defense bill. Well, now that number is set in this agreement. We have a defense number to start competing with China. We have to work out the details in what's called the NDAA, as you're familiar with. the National Defense Authorization Act that lays out how we're going to change the way military spending has been done to start competing with China, where I think a lot of people have been asleep at the wheel for too long. We're going to finally start confronting that threat. And then in the individual appropriations bills, go into some of these agencies that are wasting money, that are using their money to weaponize government. We set up a committee looking into the weaponization of government. Now we're going to be starting to follow through in the appropriations process there as well. All that starts, probably next week you'll see more of the bills coming out of committee, and then pretty soon onto the House floor. Well, I hope everybody that wants to continue this fight to cut spending is with us on those appropriations bills that will be doing just that.
Well, you know what Lindsey Graham said about the defense money, right? He says it's a disaster. He's going to do everything in his power to stop this bill because of the defense money. And you've got Morgan Ortagus also talking about Biden's incredibly dangerous defense budget. Taking Biden's historic inflation into account, it would shrink the military by 6% in real terms over the next 2 years, which is unpalatable considering the threats we face. She writes, she's also talking about, just looking at specific numbers, the Biden budget takes the U.S. Navy from 298 ships to 291. The chief of naval operations recently testified to Congress that the Navy needs 373 ships and 150 unmanned platforms to deal with the multiple threats we face.
We've got to shift the way that the Pentagon has been spending money in defense. Again, shift it towards the threat that China poses. We set up that select committee on China that Chairman Gallagher has headed up and has done some really important work on.
Right, but just to be clear, this bill doesn't do that. This bill doesn't do that.
This bill sets the stage. This bill does increase defense. Overall spending numbers are down, which means non-defense, non-veterans programs will get cut. Defense will not get cut. It's the only agency, in addition with veterans, that is not cut. The other agencies get cut over 20%. But defense is not only spared, but we need to shift the focus of how the money is spent. We've got to stop the woke ideology that we see over at the Pentagon and start focusing the money on building a military that focuses on China. That is our main threat right now. And that hasn't been the focus at the Pentagon. You've seen other things that they're dealing with that have nothing to do with the main threat we've got to face. That has to shift. Right. And that's going to be part of what we do in the NDAA and the appropriations process.
Well, you know the issues. I agree. The China threat is the #1 issue that this country needs to focus more on. But you need a willing partner in the White House. And Joe Biden has had a soft on China policy. Kevin McCarthy tried hard to get spending cuts in there, to get caps in there, to do as much as he could for the IRS. Rescinding that money, but Joe Biden's not moving.
Well, he moved some on this bill, and he's going to have to move some on the appropriations bills. You're right about the fact that he has literally given a blind eye towards China, won't even confront China on so many fronts, militarily, economically, and yet we are, and we've made it very clear. When we put the select committee together on China, we got bipartisan buy-in. There are Democrats in Congress who recognize this threat, too. There are some that don't. But if you look at the makeup of the committee, it's people that realize that China is a major threat. And we're doing this both on the oversight side. Look at Jim Jordan and Jamie Comer and the work that their committees are doing to expose this whole ring of corruption that involves China giving money to the Biden family through all these web of deceitful LLCs. That's finally coming out. The mainstream media doesn't want to cover it. You have, and others have too. But at the end of the day, how we confront China militarily is going to do a lot to determine whether or not we can reverse the threat that they pose, because it's a major threat, not just to Taiwan today, but to America down the road. It's got to be dealt with.
Yeah, I mean, look at just yesterday and this story that we're talking about this morning, how they sent the jet so close to a U.S. Jet as well in the air. Majority Leader Scalise, it's always a pleasure. Thanks so much for being here this morning.